Hi everyone. Last week we looked at how Elijah prophesied a drought in Israel and how God told him to hide from Ahab and Jezebel who wanted to kill him. First of all by a brook where he was fed by ravens, and then in the Canaanite town of Zarephath where he was taken in by a widow. 1 Kings 17 is primarily a story of God providing for Elijah in unexpected ways and places. At the end of 3 years in Zarephath, God then tells Elijah to go and present himself to Ahab and to tell him that it would soon start raining. On the way there, he bumps into Obadiah, who was in charge of Ahab's palace and was a devoted follower of the Lord, not of Baal, the fertility god worshipped by Ahab and Jezebel. During the meeting, Obadiah reminds Elijah how he had hid and fed 100 prophets of the true God in 2 caves to save them from being murdered by Jezebel. That's important later in the story. When Elijah arrives at the palace, he tells Ahab to summon all Israel, presumably not the whole of Israel, because that was millions of them, but representatives rather than the whole country, at Mt Carmel, and to bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah. And there he challenges these false prophets to a contest to prove which God is the real one, Yahweh or Baal. Whichever God burns up a bull by fire from heaven is the true God. The 850 prophets of Baal go first, dancing and chanting round the bull, calling on Baal to answer them. But absolutely nothing happens. Elijah then starts to taunt them, asking if Baal was maybe gone on holiday, or he was taking a nap, or he'd gone to the loo. And when it's Elijah's turn, he makes it doubly hard for the bull to actually burn by pouring on buckets full of water. But it all gets completely consumed by fire from heaven when he calls on God. So Elijah wins the contest and orders the watching Israelites to kill the false prophets, which they do. He then tells Ahab to hurry up and to drive down to Jezreel before the rainstorm starts. Elijah is given supernatural strength to run the 18 miles ahead of Ahab's chariot, which was capable of about 30 miles an hour. So Elijah effectively outsprinted Usain Bolt, whose top speed was around 28 miles an hour, but over 18 miles rather than 100 meters. When he gets to Jezreel, Ahab tells Jezebel what has happened, including how all of her prophets have been put to death. Jezebel is not amused and sends Elijah this message: "May the gods strike me and even kill me if by this time tomorrow I have not killed you just as you killed them." At this point, a very strange thing happens. The man who up to now has seemed to be totally fearless, who told King Ahab to his face what a rotten heathen he was, who took on 850 of the enemy and beat them hands down, and who had just beaten the world speed record, is suddenly filled by fear and runs for his life. First he heads south to the town of Beersheba, which isn't in Israel, it's in Judah, where Yahweh the Lord was still worshipped. But he doesn't stop there. He leaves his servant there and he heads further south into the wilderness. Some commentators think he was intent on committing suicide as he was heading into the desert, and this time it wasn't because God had told him to go and hide. It was all his own idea. Would God provide for him if he was no longer trusting him? Now, what on earth was going on with Elijah that he would suddenly fall from such an incredible height of triumph to actually wishing he was dead? I want to suggest it was a combination of factors. I think first of all he was exhausted, physically, emotionally and spiritually exhausted. He'd just had enough. He'd spent a whole day on Mount Carmel watching and taunting the prophets of Baal, And then he'd rebuilt the altar by himself with big blocks of stone. He'd chopped up a huge bull as a sacrifice. And then he'd gone on an 18-mile sprint at the end of the day. He was tired. I also wonder if somehow his victory had actually become just that, his victory. It's very easy when we've done something good for God or his kingdom to slip from giving him all the glory to keeping a bit of it for ourselves. It's not a big step from thinking, wasn't that wonderful, praise God, to didn't I do well? It's also clear from the conversation Elijah has with God, which is to say the least a bit of a pity party, I think, that he thinks he's on his own in the fight. Elijah always has this image of being a one-man band. When he challenges the false prophets, he says to the bystanders, I'm the only prophet of the Lord who's left. It's like he's completely forgotten what Obadiah had said to him about the 100 other prophets who had been saved. There is one thing you've got to admire about Elijah, though, that even when he's broken in spirit, he knows where to head for, to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God, where God met with Moses and gave him the 10 Commandments. He might be fleeing, he might be in a mess, but he's going to where he thinks he'll find God. What I love about the story is that God deals with Elijah in such an amazingly gentle and gracious way. It's not soft, but it is gentle. First of all, he still provides what Elijah needs to sustain him for the journey. The angel comes to encourage him and feeds him twice. Secondly, God does not chastise him for his lack of faith. If I was God, I'd probably have called him a big girl's blouse and asked him why he was running away from a crazy woman when he hadn't flinched in front of 850 blokes. And thirdly, God actually asks Elijah twice what he was doing there. I think God cares about what we think and about why we think what we think. He doesn't expect or want us to be robots or machines. Elijah had already known God as a God of great power and a God of great provision. Here God reveals himself in a much more personal and protective way. Up on the mountain, it's not in the storm, it's not in the earthquake, it's not in the fire that God reveals himself, but it's in the still, small voice. Love is never violent. God whispered his love to Elijah, and I believe that that whisper began to heal Elijah's broken spirit. It's really interesting for me that God then tells him to go back the way he came. If Elijah had asked God what to do in the first place, he needn't have made that huge journey. Sometimes we're a bit like that. But God wasn't finished with Elijah. It just meant that his journey up to Damascus, right up north, miles and miles away, took much, much longer than it needed to have done. One thing I have learned from this story over the years is about teamwork. Now, Elijah was very much a one-man band. But here he goes and anoints Elisha as his successor. But before Elijah retires permanently, Elisha becomes his apprentice. When Elijah is taken up into heaven, Elisha's ministry is more fruitful than Elijah's ever was. Partly at least because he is actively involved in training up young prophets in what was called a school of prophets. There should be no such thing as a one-man or one-person ministry. The New Testament teaches us that we're all one body. Every part is important. If one part is hurting, the rest of the body suffers too. If one part fails to function, it affects the whole body. I believe we need to learn how to work together as a body, something that Elijah never quite grasped. When we do that, with everyone playing their unique part to their full ability, then the world's going to sit up and take notice of the church.